Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. Hope you can hear me. As ever, always paranoid about the tech working. Still not over it. What, episode 225, and I'm still asking you to tell me whether the sound check's working. But anyway, I'll get over it one day. I'm Jack Chew. This is Chewing It Over. Most days, weekdays, we come live 12:30 to 1 o'clock to talk about whatever is topical. Often that is where it meets MSK and healthcare and education, all the things I'm most passionate about, but also where it intersects with culture is always important. And we've talked about many different things on this show. And this is a subject that I very much wanted to visit. You would have had to have your head under a rock to not notice there's been a scandal engulfing cricket, but also then into the wider society about, of course, racial issues that has occurred off the back of testimony from Azeem Rafiq. And when I thought about who would I want to, it's not the sort of thing I would usually riff on my opinions on anything. But with something like this, I've got plenty of stuff that I need to learn. And also, when I think about who would I want to learn from, I certainly, you can do a bit of Googling, you can do a bit of looking on YouTube and stuff, but I think it's always better to look at people into your shared past that might be able to then help you to understand things better. So I could think of no one better than Has Haider. Interestingly, our paths have crossed in a few different ways. It was a year below me at school when I was at secondary school, and whilst we weren't very close, we knew of each other. And he's just told me that he was in my sister's school year. But then also, funnily enough, I then left school at 16. He went on into sixth form. But then he came up to me. I think in a lecture I was teaching at Nottingham Uni Physio School, and he came over afterwards, and it was just a face I wasn't expecting to emerge from the crowd. And so we caught up then as he then studied physiotherapy later on. At Nottingham Physio School, which is where I qualified. So again, a few different ways in which our paths have crossed. Now a physio will get to introduce himself in a second, but certainly someone that, and as a cricketer, it just felt the perfect opportunity for me to catch up with Has and to chat through these things, which are contentious and complicated. We're never going to solve them in half an hour. We're not going to try and pretend to either, but it just felt like something that might be worth us broadcasting, and maybe we can go again if you guys find it interesting, as well as if Has can put up with me for any longer than half an hour. So let's bring him on, and hopefully he can hear us all right. Has, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you good, yeah.
All right, nice one. Right, so I hope my intro's done it justice there, but could you just introduce yourself to the listeners, especially including sort of professional roles and that you're up to now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Hasnehn, or Has for short. I'm a physio at Airedale Hospital in West Yorkshire, and I'm currently in a seconded post with Health Education England, which is looking at expanding student placement through innovative design models, incorporating tech and virtual and so on and so forth, which is obviously very apt at the moment. So I'm really enjoying that. So, but my current speciality, ironically, is MSK. So
fantastic. But we're not going to weigh in on the clinical today, but we can do in the future. Get you back on for ankle sprain pod 101 or something. But interesting. So you're working at the hospital of which we were both born. So exactly. That's we grew up about 10 miles apart between Keighley and Colne, isn't it?
Yeah, near enough, yeah.
But then also you, especially relevant to this conversation, is that unlike me, you played cricket and have done most of your life. Still play?
Yeah, still play.
Yeah. And so I think that when it comes to that, I hope you can't remember playing against and with me at house cricket, because I think you probably will have definitely outperformed me then. But that's probably the extent, the upper limit of my cricket really was house cricket at school. So how's it felt then watching this unfold? It's been a fair journey, and I know you tweeted about it a few weeks ago, and it hadn't even really lit the touch paper as much. You got a sense of this. It was touching various different parts of your world. So could you just tell us a little bit about how it's been feeling for you?
Yeah, I think the topic itself is something that's it never drifts into the periphery, does it? Racism, that word is always used in the media, and it's always associated with sport in some capacity, isn't it? So when it started to venture into sort of our world, or my world of interest being cricket, it wasn't, I'll be honest with you, it wasn't a total surprise. It wasn't a total surprise at all, based on some past experiences maybe that I've experienced myself or witnessed, or even attitudes and feelings and that sort of like gut instinct you get from a particular situation. So, it's I won't say it's a total shock, and it's not like totally raw. I think it's just brought back, and it brings ill feeling into your head and your heart, doesn't it? About something that you just think in this day and age, how is this still happening? Basically,
sure, yeah, like a heart sink type thing where it's like, here we go again.
Yeah.
Mate, well, I feel that. What can we throw back? Just because I do find it interesting, coincidentally how our paths have crossed then in a couple of ways. But if we think back then to growing up in Keighley, which is in Yorkshire, I mean, again, very relevant to the story, although now increasingly clearly a national and international story. But what's and could you just reflect on that and how welcome you felt in the sport of cricket or not, and also then how might that have changed over time as you went through school, uni, etc.
Yeah, so I think growing up, as most of us did, we probably played the sport that our iconic figures in our life played. So, for example, your dad or your uncle or your brother. So my dad was obviously a very well respected and a really good cricketer locally, in the West Yorkshire region. So I think that's how I, started off playing. I'd go watch him. I think I was scoring at a young age, and then started to play myself. Now, was I playing out of an interest because I loved the sport, or was I playing because my dad wanted to shape me as a cricketer? Maybe a bit of both, but certainly the culture at that time was very much, it was harder to be included. You weren't included naturally. You had to integrate. You had to make the step of putting your stake in the ground and saying, I am here, rather than, for example, I was always a minority in the teams that I played within. And the predominant experience that I've had has always been positive, thankfully. But that's because I've got a strong character, and I've been brought up with a strong character. Really good influences in my life. But yeah, it's always felt like you have had to, as a minority or a single Asian player within a team which is predominantly non-Asian, you've had to be the one who's made the step in saying that I will integrate more so than feeling included. And we mentioned really brief at the beginning, a lot of the culture around, especially local cricket, let's say village and club cricket is very much, you'd play the game, and then you'd go to the pub afterwards, so the local pub, and you can see how that would already have a bit of an impact on integration, because the difference between, let's say, culture and religion, as we spoke about very briefly before, can have a profound impact on whether you're going to integrate or not. So, you can be sat in a pub and not necessarily be having an alcoholic drink, which is perfectly fine, isn't it? But then the perception of maybe people in and around the area of, well, there's a person of colour there. Should he even be sat in a pub? So you were never. It was never an easy feeling. You always had an uneasy feeling in your heart, really, whenever you were doing something which was totally innocent, so to speak. So it just isn't easy. It was never easy, if that made sense. Playing was fine. The playing part was fine, but the actual, integration side was difficult. It was difficult.
Yeah, I think that you've hit on. Yeah, and we were just off air. We were talking about that, weren't we? About how there's some complexities there that you just don't. You would take for granted. I'd take for granted. And I think it takes there was some moments in my life where I remember being in a pub. I don't think it was necessarily. We were definitely watching sport, but I don't think it was like off the back of having played. It could have been after playing football, but we're in the pub having a drink, and then someone comes over and was having a chat who we knew, but had said, I didn't know you were allowed to be in here. To my Asian mate, who's having a soft drink, watching the football, and didn't realise how insensitive that language was. But what they were meaning wasn't that when they then, quite rightly, you can imagine we all challenged them on that pretty much simultaneously and made a bit of a scene of them. He then was like walking it back saying, oh, I realise how that sounded, as if to say, like, there's a sign on the door. But he was meaning, like, he was just being culturally insensitive about the fact that it's like, are you meant to be in drinking establishments that serve alcohol? And that? Very clumsy of him. But regardless of why, that atmosphere that sometimes does affect it, and the fact that some players might not be comfortable in a drinking establishment when that is just the done thing within English cricket culture is relevant. And so do you feel that then there were those moments where, like you're saying, it was about having to tolerate, say, or integrate that way, rather than it being that accommodations were made to make it more comfortable for everyone involved?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. And I think that's the thing, like, I think attitudes have changed, haven't they, certainly over the past 10 years. And there's probably been sporting examples of, let's say, our neighbouring areas, such as the Jonathan Woodgate-Lee Bowie thing in Leeds. If you recall that, where now, if you do go out in the surrounding areas, it's probably more inclusive, isn't it, in seeing different faces in different places, sure. and that's what integration is, isn't it? That's what integration should be, is you should be able to feel welcome wherever you go. So yeah, definitely, it was something that I think has probably shaped a lot of amateur players' cricketing experiences over the years. More so, let's say, the institution of Yorkshire Cricket Club, where that's different to my example, because that's someone's place of work, isn't it? If you're aspiring to be the next England all-round or whatever it may be that Azeem was aspiring for, he's going to work to sort of hone his skills to be that person. Whereas for me, it's recreational. So my tweet the other week, Jack, as he saw, was, I'm probably going to have a year out from cricket this year. Maybe influenced by what's gone on, but maybe just at this time in my life, I need to maybe prioritise my family and some other things like that. But sure. For him, look at the drastic impact it's had on his life, and without going into the nuances of what's come out more recently, and like we talk about optics and diversion things, it's obviously had an impact where he now, his life path has changed, hasn't it, by what he's experienced in his place of work. So I've maybe stepped into a different realm there of conversation.
Well, there's so many different angles, isn't there? That we'd said that it would be hard to try and chart a specific map there. But what we would talk, it's a good point to bring, because there's some stuff we said off air that we almost do want to bring forward, because I'll be honest, they were our best points, weren't they? So we want to make sure we repeat them on air. But I think one of the things that we'd said was that this recent suggestions that he'd been anti-Semitic. Even more recently, there's suggestions of him being inappropriate with a minor, a 16-year-old, I think. I always say that for when the media wants to imply that therefore we should shut up about all of it, is the most nonsense thing in the world. It's like, if you bring up other further issues that need addressing, fair enough. But you add that to the things that need addressing. You don't discount from them, right? The hilarity that every whistleblower needs moral purity. And I suppose I say that as someone who's a gobshite on the internet, right? If I had to be flawless just to make a point I want to make, then God forbid I wouldn't be talking. And so that's something just to be said. I think it was clear that we agree on that. But one of the other things there that I did want to raise is that when I was coming through and playing different sports growing up, I will admit that, because I played at Colne Cricket Club for a bit, right, badly, granted, as a junior. But there were times where, compared to when I then played at Colne and Nelson Rugby Club, you naturally, because of the sort of cultural diversity of the area, meant that you would have our junior squad, Nelson Cricket Club, you play against some of the teams over near Bradford Way and stuff. There'd be sometimes majority Asian.
Yeah.
And so whereas in rugby, it'd be incredibly rare. In fact, also then different areas you'd travel. You have West Indian heritage players as well in cricket. Yeah. Again, a lack of diversity in rugby across the sports in which I played. So I suppose I will admit maybe a bit of naivety. When I saw some of this brewing, I thought, wow, of all the sports I would think that maybe not be protected, I wasn't quite that naive, right? But that of all the things for a scandal like that to be for it to be so pervasive, that did surprise me. Now, you can tell me now, how naive have I been, etc., with that?
I won't say you've been naive at all, because, again, examples of locally, there are, like I said, if you feel that you have to put energy into being made to be included, let's say, like I said, as myself, maybe as a minority within a team, if you don't have that energy or that ability to focus that energy, there's opportunities to play in a team which is predominantly Asian, for example. So locally there are, and there has been successful teams that are predominantly Asian. Now that brings its own territory of attitudes towards that. So examples that I have seen of intolerance has been when there has been matches played, or let's say a semi-final played, which you hear and observe of a team playing against a predominantly Asian team. And,
Right.
if there's, the spectators from the side, maybe there is beer flowing. I know for a fact there's been instances in our local leagues where there has been racial abuse. But that team itself probably feels that actually I can play within a team at a local amateur level and feel included immediately. But like you said, it's probably more pertinent in the sport of cricket, because those minority groups, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian, and really nice to see. Afghanistan have been absolutely firing on the world stage, haven't they, recently? Maybe not a huge demographic locally, but
Sure.
They have teams of their own, and I don't say of their own in that dismissive manner, but it's again, it just goes back to that inclusive nature, doesn't it? It's no different to the area of MSK. You create a forum, don't you, where people feel included to speak about what they feel they want to speak about on a particular topic. So in that team where you don't feel like you need to put energy into feeling included, and you can still go and play, it's one less thing to worry about, isn't it? But I don't think you'd be naive in thinking, why is this happening?
But it's interesting, though, you're saying how, if anything, sometimes access can sometimes lead to a sense of, albeit not overt, but, it's all self-segregates a little bit culturally.
Yeah, it does.
In certain teams when there's a need. But I suppose I just looked on and did think that you've got usually a good cultural melting pot, particularly where we grew up in cricket, compared even in the same area to other sports of which are less of interest to some, for the reasons you've talked about before with regards to familial heritage and stuff like that, and what you play. It's one of the reasons I was running across the fells when you were playing cricket, is that what you're following on from your dad. What did he put in your hands or on your feet at that time?
Exactly.
What it says in the title that I definitely want to visit is the early days of this breaking. The Yorkshire County Cricket Club had originally tried to sweep it under the carpet and dismissed the quite serious, very serious allegations and commentary as banter. We've investigated it internally, and then that word was something that, of course, was used in that instance when the world look on and think, right, we've heard that plenty. Some real misbehaviour dismissed as if banter, as if that's somehow some sort of clear all. I did want to talk through that with you, because that is inexcusable, but then also it's sport, and also in the north of England we are full of banter, right? So where is the appropriate intersection then, where that can happen? And have you had experiences there where the good and bad side of that line that you could help us with?
Yeah, most definitely. I think this is a really tricky one, isn't it, to address, in the sense of, I think banter is something that it drives from like a personal viewpoint as to how you would view certain language, or let's say topics, for example. So, and what forums that you're within, and what four walls you may be within, where that banter sort of originates from or is thrown about. For me, I've always drawn the line at what the good person would perceive as being right language and wrong language, if that makes sense. So in no way, shape or form have I ever advocated the use of the P word, for example. That would never be banter for me, ever. And touch wood, in my circles, my friendship groups, it's never been a thing. I've never had to address it, but I've had to address it on behalf of others, some of my own teammates, where if that kind of language rears its head, they might think it's banter between them, because there's nobody to challenge that behaviour But because I've got the ability to challenge it based on my character, it gets squashed out pretty quick. But if you can imagine you're sat in a changing room and there's banter being thrown around of certain terminology, so you don't have the strength of character to maybe challenge that, because you might think it'll influence whether you're playing it seconds a week after or not. That could be really hard for somebody, But also, again, like I said, Jack, if it's in the place of work, imagine 1 o'clock, it'll be lunchtime shortly. Imagine somebody use that language in the kitchen at work or something. It's hard to challenge, isn't it?
And people don't make that distinction, do they, relevantly, right? So there's village club cricket. There's then working in hobbyist territory, right? Is different to when it becomes then someone's place of work. But what you've said there, I think, have you had mates of yours whereby that the P word is bandied around over liberally because they're almost leaning into it? Like NWA reappropriated the M word. Do you know what I mean? Because that was something that you grew up with. Like, not for a second suggesting it was a disgusting slur. Always has been. No one can pretend to be naive, especially growing up where we grew up. However, there is also then there's almost like there is a banter subculture where some people are leaning into that.
There is.
Have you experienced that as well? I know you've said you don't personally and your friends don't personally.
Yeah, so that banter subculture would certainly be attributed to, let's say, for example, certain language used in sort of young American groups, for example. Now, that is used. It is used in a very sort of a loose term, but also you're talking to somebody who does try and lead by example. So if I would be sort of like challenging people on using that in a banterous way, I certainly couldn't use that in that subculture myself of saying, well, we use it between ourselves as minority groups to make it okay, because then that would be hypocritical, wouldn't it, in me challenging the language of others. So it is used, and I think maybe that's part of the problem. But that goes down to education right from a school level, doesn't it? So, my aunt is a liaison officer at a very inner town primary school, which has its challenges around that kind of behaviour and language. And I think there's probably not enough being done to address it at that level. So then it does spill out into your sporting communities, your working communities, and so on and so forth, which muddies the water furthermore for then challenging right and wrong in our instances, if that makes sense.
Because we're going through that journey as a culture. We are kind of always reassessing what, not just language, but also just there's different sort of moral standards that we want to hold ourselves and each other to. And therefore, when you throw back even a few years, but certainly even into a decade and stuff, if we think about in our teens, when we knew each other at school, these are quite different times. And whilst I remember when I went to college, when I left school and went to college for a couple of years to do my A levels, we played against, and then one time I actually was a ringer for a Sunday League team, and it was called P Word FC, right? They were leaning so far into that. They were some of my mates from college that, and by the way, they were a very inclusive team in a way, because they were just like, if you got boots, strap them on. But they were just some Asian friends of mine from college who then called their football Sunday League team that, because we all had silly football Sunday League team names. Right? Now, that didn't mean, though, that then anyone in that league thought that was then fair game to start using that slur in any circumstance on or off the pitch. But I imagine, and I haven't spoken to them for a bit, but I imagine they would still defend its usage in that instance, because it was something like they were of Pakistani origin and they were going to lean into that term. You sound like you're saying that, especially these days, that muddies the water more than we need.
I believe so, because it could be that instance there could be fighting fire with fire. So if you're trying to resolve a situation using logic, but you're still not getting a resolution to the situation, do you then go above and beyond and think, right, we'll embrace it, we'll take this head on? Do you know what I mean? If you think that's okay, or if there's attitudes thinking that's okay, we'll embrace it and we'll fly that flag. Similarly to if you're relating to the NWA stuff, if that makes sense, that
I know what you mean.
That attitude of,
that's what they were doing,
this is what we are. And if you're not going to include us, come up against us, and it might be a bit like, it may well be a bit like that, but I certainly don't have that kind of fighting kind of attitude in my ability. I think I've always been a talker, Jack. I've never been a fighter. You know what I mean?
Well, no, I know what you mean, and when I think back to some of those lads, I have to drop them a message, won't I, and get them to reflect. But because I'd be so interested to hear what they said. But they were dead confrontational with it, but also just full of banter. Like, you never had a moment off with it. And whilst I remember saying to them, I remember in changing rooms, I said, "Look, lads, this is. I'm here, got my boots, but I'm putting this shirt on now. You know, these things are uncomfortable. They say, good, you should feel uncomfortable. That's the point. It's banter." What do you think is the future then for this? How do you think, like, worst case scenario is it fizzles out and nothing changes, or that things only ramp up and no one tries to then move us towards any resolution? You know, so where is the through line, and what do you either hope for, and what do you expect might happen?
It's tricky, because I don't think that in any society is racism ever going to die out. I think it's ingrained, isn't it? Unfortunately, but I feel that from this particular instance and what's happening at the moment, it should hopefully give people a platform to be able to speak out in whatever channels they need to. You know, so a lot of these undertones kind of get, like you say, swept under the carpet, and I've had that a lot in work and outside of work, but it gets swept under the carpet when that's a repeated instance of just sweep under the carpet, maybe not speak out about it. I want there to be an opportunity for people to be able to challenge it, so not just people of a minority ethnic group challenging it, but the people around that to challenge that practice, you know, and say that is not okay, because it may well be that those people of that particular group might take offence to that. You know, it's a collective attitude, isn't it, to a problem, and I think that's hopefully what I would like to see, is a bit of a more of a positive response, rather than this response of what's happening now, for example, of people being able to say, "Oh, well, you know, he's come out and spoke about it, but you know, he's not exactly living a model lifestyle himself, is it?" You know, I think, like you say, that's optics, and it's an opportunity for you to twist what's the true message. I think from this, you want the true message to ring through. That's what I would like. That true core message to ring through, to be able to take from it what you want, deflect off the bits that are going to be trying to divert you from what that true message is, and essentially just give people a bit more of an opportunity to get in touch with your moral compass. You know what's right and you know what's wrong. I would like to think a lot of people know that in society. And if you see something that's wrong, challenge it in the right channel, right way. You know, and try and promote yourself as doing what is right. You know, so.
And the costs for challenging it need to not be, like you made such a good point earlier about how if challenging it in any way then means you're in the seconds next week out of just the pettiness of that culture. Do you know what I mean? That's not that's exactly the sort of thing that it needs to be. There can't be those sorts of consequences, because that's exactly what makes people bite their tongue, which just perpetuates things and misbehaviours in such a way that if that's then the done culture, that then people think that that's the given, and then that's why people then want to think they can dismiss it all as banter. It's not an easy solution, but that's an important one, isn't it? Where there is this opportunity to put it right at every level, and so, you know, I think that's absolutely spot on. Is that what, just to intersect it with our shared profession, which of course, you know, this podcast wasn't necessarily about, but that is, we have had on Chewing It Over, that is a subject we've certainly visited more than, say, cricket and recent change. How do you feel physiotherapy, MSK, that, call it what we will in that take what section of it you want, how do you feel that fares, and what experiences have you had, be that positive or negative, in that space?
Interesting, because I think I've had a few instances from, let's say, attitudes from service users towards me as being a person of colour, providing their advice and treatment. Okay, and I've obviously navigated that in a very diplomatic way. I've had instances of where I've felt that certain behaviours by service users hasn't been challenged by colleagues and staff.
Got you.
And almost the hush attitude has, not given me confidence in thinking that anything would get done should a circumstance arise or a situation arise that is, needs to be challenged. And also from fellow colleagues as well, I believe that there has been attitudes and language that is used that hasn't been dealt with appropriately, in my experience of being a qualified physio. And that does leave a bit of a sour taste in your mouth, really. But what is my take-home message from that is, do I want to be somebody who rattles the cage excessively that might sort of raise, trouble causer kind of tag, or do you then go above and beyond to try and promote right behaviours?
Got you.
So whilst my experiences have been very, very small, I won't say it's frequent, certainly not frequent, but one negative experience is one negative experience, isn't it?
Well, especially in the wrong person at the wrong time, that can be plenty enough to then lose that talent to an area that obviously we want that talent to stick around. And so, exactly. It's definitely important.
I was just to say though, but there have been instances, certainly at areas where I've worked in, where championing that diversity has produced good outcomes as well. The ability to tap into the demographic of the area that you serve, to be able to create opportunities for people from different ethnic backgrounds to champion their bilingual skills or their ability to build that patient practitioner rapport for a good outcome in certain intervention groups, for example. Right. We've been able to tap into that and been able to sort of really showcase that as well, if that makes sense. So it's not all negative, I would say. I think it is good as well.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to hear that, certainly, because we want to champion the good examples and make sure that then finding a route to call out and to change the bad needs to be coupled, of course, with then championing best practices in that instance. And I think I've certainly witnessed some of that. I wonder if it'd be interesting, because there's some great examples that came out when I worked in Nottingham, which might coincide with when you were then at Nottingham Uni and stuff. That I think are good examples. But then also one of the most persuasive things I think in the last 18 months, I think one of the most sort of persuasive things that has been for me is just thinking about the social outcomes that would come from health and education, from having a representative staff set, or at least accessible staff set, for what is demographically that location at the very least, right? It's a low bar I'm setting, granted, but what I'm meaning is, when I think about what these pragmatic reforms that everyone will get on with, like, I can't think of anyone that would oppose that, apart from you sort of frothing, loudmouth, mad right wingers, right? You can't think who's going to say, wouldn't it be right if this hospital was there to serve this community of which has this breakdown? Now, that then sometimes people get lost in the statistics of that, as if that's relevant. It's like, no, it's about who feels included, who feels involved, who feels that they're not, like you said, having to make an effort to get the care that they've actually, in this instance, or paid for by plenty of tax. And that, I think, is where we need to champion those good stories, and where we can kind of get a huge conglomerate of different people that will agree on that principle, because that's an area that some places in the country are so homogenous that they don't even think like that. Whereas I think that's interesting, and why I really appreciate you coming on today as well, is because that's, as I said, didn't we, when we were texting, it was like growing up 10 miles apart is probably really helpful to get this conversation rolling. We're never going to solve it in half an hour, but if me and you were speaking from Keighley to Hertfordshire, and you didn't have that sort of shared insight, so then there's relevant differences too. I think that sometimes that just helps to get the ball rolling. So really appreciate it, mate. Really thank you for your time. I think if we can, let's make sure we keep in touch, and then I'll try and shine a light on some of the other work you're doing with regards to sort of student placement, entrepreneurship as well, because that's certainly another area of passion, as well as then we can do some clinical stuff as well. Like, why not? But I always think sometimes where it intersects with with culture is when we just I slid into your DMs, and I really appreciate you answering that call, mate. So
No problem.
we'll catch up soon. All right,
Yeah,
take
great.
care, bud.
Cheers, Jack.
Cheers, everyone.
See ya.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Speak soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.